The lock wouldn't give. Brian's fingers, purple and numb, fumbled with the frozen metal while wind shrieked at 60 miles per hour. Inside the overturned truck, 25 dogs screamed raw, desperate sounds that clawed at something deep in his chest. One was already dead. He'd seen it through the gap, a border collie, eyes frosted open, tongue black. Behind him, Max barked frantically, limping through knee-deep snow on 3 good legs. Cancer was eating the old dog from the inside. But he'd dragged Brian here anyway, pulled him 200 yards through a blizzard that wasn't supposed to hit for another 6 hours. The crowbar slipped. Brian's hands shook not from cold. 15 years ago, you let 6 men die. The metal groaned. Tonight, 25 lives, sir. The numbers were never fair. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The cabin sat at 9,000 feet, where Colorado's Rocky Mountains scraped against a sky that never felt close enough. Brian Carter had built most of it himself. 240 square feet of timber and tia, no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a gas burner, and silence thick enough to sleep in. He woke every morning at 5:30, the same nightmare dissolving into the same dim light. He'd check the traps, split firewood until his shoulders burned, then cook oatmeal for Max, while the old German shepherd watched from his blanket near the stove. They didn't need conversation. They'd said everything that mattered 15 years ago in a desert that still lived in Brian's ears. 6 tin cups sat on the shelf above the sink. Brian never used them, never touched them. They gathered dust in a perfect row, each one representing a name he whispered when the nights got too quiet. Thompson, Reed, Garcia, Patterson, Wu, Morrison. Sometimes he'd pour whiskey into all 6, drink each one, then stumble outside and vomit into the snow. Max would find him there at dawn, press his graying muzzle against Brian's face until the man stood up again. The PTSD showed itself in small ways. Brian slept with a lantern burning. He couldn't hear helicopters without his hands shaking. Fireworks sent him crawling under furniture. The Veterans Affairs Hospital was 90 miles away, down roads that became impassable from November through March. He'd applied for mental health support 14 times. Each rejection letter said the same thing: insufficient evidence of service-connected disability. His disability check came to $1,247 monthly. Most of it went to Max. On Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the blizzard, Brian made his only trip to town that month. Pine Ridge was 23 miles down the mountain, a collection of gas stations and hardware stores that smelled like diesel and pine sap. He drove his rusted Ford pickup to the veterinary clinic on Main Street, where Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been treating Max for 6 months. She was waiting in the exam room, her face arranged in that expression medical professionals practice for delivering bad news. Max lay on the steel table, panting, his back left leg swollen to twice its normal size. "The cancer's spread to his lungs," she said quietly. 4 to 8 weeks. Brian, maybe less." The room tilted slightly. Brian gripped the edge of the table. "I can ease his pain, but—" "He stays with me," Brian interrupted. His voice came out hoarse. "Until the end, however long that is." Mitchell nodded. She'd heard about Brian, about why he lived alone in the mountains. Everyone in Pine Ridge had. The bill came to $847. Brian paid in cash, counting bills from an envelope that represented most of what remained in his account. $1,053 left, enough for another month, maybe two if he was careful. Max licked his hand during the drive home. Neither of them knew they had 3 days left together. The radio crackled to life at 9 o'clock Friday night. Brian was cleaning his dinner plate when the emergency broadcast cut through the static blizzard warning, Category 3, arriving 6 hours earlier than predicted. Sustained winds of 50 to 70 miles per hour. Visibility near zero. Life-threatening conditions. He looked at Max, who hadn't moved from his blanket all evening. The old dog's breathing came shallow and labored, each inhale a visible effort. Brian had planned to drive down to Pine Ridge in the morning for supplies, canned goods, rice, fuel. Now that window had closed, he took inventory. 8 cans of beef stew, 3 pounds of rice, 6 eggs, 1.5 pounds of dog food for Max, enough for 4 days if he was careful, maybe 5 if he stretched it. The wood pile outside held 3 cords, more than sufficient. He'd survive. They both would. By 10:30, the power died. Brian lit 2 kerosene lanterns and fed more logs into the stove. Wind hammered the cabin's walls, finding gaps in the timber and shrieking through them. Snow began to accumulate against the windows, not falling so much as being thrown horizontally by the gale. At 11:15, Max lurched to his feet and began barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something frantic, desperate. He limped to the door, whining, then looked back at Brian with eyes that held an urgency the man had only seen once before in Fallujah, moments before the bomb. "Easy, boy. It's just the storm." But Max wouldn't stop. He clawed at the door, his bad leg buckling beneath him. Brian grabbed his heavy coat, pulled on insulated gloves, and strapped a headlamp over his wool cap. He took the flare gun from the shelf, a military surplus item, with 1 remaining flare and a coil of climbing rope. Then he opened the door into a wall of white chaos. The cold hit like a physical blow, -30, maybe worse with the wind chill. His headlamp barely penetrated 10 feet through the horizontal snow. Max pushed past him, limping determinedly toward the old Forest Service road 200 yards east. Brian followed, leaning into wind that tried to shove him backward. His beard froze within seconds. Each breath felt like inhaling broken glass. Then he saw the lights. Faint, yellowish, wrong. Headlights, but tilted at an unnatural angle. The truck had gone off the road where the switchback curved sharpest. An 18-wheeler, jackknifed and rolled onto its side. The cab buried nose first in a snowdrift. The trailer's rear doors hung open, swinging in the wind. Brian checked the cab first. Blood on the steering wheel. Still wet. Footprints leading down the mountain, already half filled with fresh snow. The driver had abandoned the wreck. Then he heard them, the dogs, howling, barking, the sound of animals in mortal terror. The noise came from inside the trailer. Brian climbed up the tilted truck bed and looked inside. His headlamp swept across a nightmare 25 dogs crammed into metal crates, stacked 3 high. Most were standing, pressing against the bars. Some lay motionless. One, a border collie near the back, had already frozen to death. Its eyes still opens. He dropped into the trailer. The nearest crate held a German shepherd, female, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. When Brian's light hit her ear, he saw it a tattoo, 4 digits, military identification. His hands started shaking, and it wasn't from the cold. He'd seen those tattoos before. These weren't pets. These were working dogs. K9 units. His light found more tattoos. 6 dogs. 8, 16 out of 25 bore military identification marks. These were veterans, just like him. Brian pulled himself out of the trailer and stood in the screaming wind. The rational choice was clear hike back, radio for help at first light, hope someone could reach them in time. But he'd tried that calculus before. 15 years ago, he'd calculated odds while Thomas Thompson had walked toward a bomb. The math never worked. It never saved anyone. Max stood beside him, steady despite his ruined leg, despite the cancer eating through his bones. The old dog looked up at Brian with perfect clarity. This was why they'd survived, not to hide in the mountains, not to count their guilt in tin cups. Not again, Brian whispered to the storm. Not on my watch. He climbed back into the trailer and began opening crates. The first trip back took 40 minutes. Brian had fashioned a makeshift sled from a sheet of corrugated metal he'd found near the truck, loading 6 dogs onto it and dragging them through waist-deep drifts. Max led the way, his headlamp reflecting off the old dog's eyes as he broke trail through the blizzard. By the second trip, Brian's hands had lost most of their feeling. He'd wrapped the dogs in a tarp he'd torn from the truck's cab, but the cold penetrated everything. 2 of the dogs, a husky and a Belgian Malinois, were so hypothermic they'd stopped shivering, their bodies shutting down. He pulled faster, his lungs burning with each breath of air that felt sharp enough to cut. The third trip nearly killed him. Halfway back to the cabin, his legs gave out. He collapsed face first into the snow, 6 more dogs whimpering on the sled behind him. For a moment, he simply lay there, ice crusting his beard, his body begging him to sleep. Just 5 minutes? Just a moment's rest? Max bit his ear, not hard enough to break skin, but enough to shock Brian back to consciousness. The old dog stood over him, teeth bared, refusing to let him quit. Brian crawled to his knees, then his feet. He grabbed the rope and pulled. By 2:40 in the morning, all 25 dogs were inside the cabin. Brian had crammed 16 into the bedroom, laying them on every available surface. The other 9 filled the main room, pressed against each other near the wood stove. The cabin that had felt spacious for 1 man or 1 dog now held 27 bodies. The air thick with the smell of wet fur and fear. The heat wasn't enough. Brian fed the stove until it glowed red, then began breaking apart his furniture, the chair he'd carved from pine, the small table where he ate his meals. He fed them into the flames, piece by piece, watching his carefully built solitude burn for the sake of animals he'd known for less than 3 hours. At 3 in the morning, the dogs started fighting over food. Brian had opened all 8 cans of stew, cooked the rice, cracked the eggs. He divided everything into 26 portions, using his hands to shape the mixture into rough piles on the floor. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. A Rottweiler mix snapped at a golden retriever, drawing blood. The room erupted barking, gnarling. 25 traumatized animals reverting to survival instinct. Brian shouted, trying to restore order, but his voice disappeared into the chaos. Then Max moved, despite his cancer, despite his shattered leg. The old dog limped into the center of the room and barked once, a deep, commanding sound that cut through everything else. The other dogs froze. Max stood there, swaying slightly, and the room gradually quieted. He walked it to the weakest dog, a young German shepherd, female, barely 7 months old by the look of her, and lay down beside her. not touching, just close enough that she could feel his warmth, his presence, one by one. The other dogs settled. Max had established something Brian couldn't order. Pack structure, the knowledge that someone was in charge, that the chaos had a center. Brian sank against the wall, watching. His hands shook uncontrollably now, frost-nipped fingers throbbing as circulation slowly returned. He hadn't eaten, hadn't saved a single portion for himself. The last of his food was gone. And at 4:15 in the morning, the golden retriever began panting differently. Brian recognized it immediately. He'd seen it once on a farm in Nebraska when he was 12, labor. "No," he whispered. "Not now, please, not now." But nature didn't negotiate. The dog circled twice, whimpering, then lay on her side. Brian had no supplies, no knowledge, nothing but his hands and desperation. He knelt beside her, murmuring words he'd once heard a veterinarian use, trying to sound calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. The first puppy came at 4:43, stillborn. Brian pulled the tiny body clear, cut the cord with his pocket knife, tried to stimulate breathing. Nothing. He wrapped it in a piece of torn shirt and set it aside. The second puppy arrived at 5:02, alive, squeaking, writhing, impossibly small. Brian cleared its airway and placed it near the mother's belly. She began licking it immediately, her tail wagging weakly. 2 more followed, both alive. By 5:30, as the faintest gray light began filtering through the snow-crusted windows, 3 puppies nursed while their mother's breathing gradually steadied. Brian sat back against the wall, watching. Around him, 25 dogs lay in exhausted heaps. Max had finally closed his eyes, his head resting on the young shepherd's flank. The wood stove ticked and popped, burning the last pieces of Brian's chair. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, new life drew its first breaths. Brian looked at his empty hands, frostbitten, bleeding, useless for so many years. He thought about the 6 tin cups on the shelf, the names he carried like stones. He thought about Thomas Thompson, walking toward a beam while Brian had screamed for him to stop. For 15 years, he'd asked the same question: why did I survive in this moment? Surrounded by 25 military dogs he'd pulled from a frozen hell, watching 3 puppies that shouldn't exist take their first meals. The answer felt closer than it ever had. Maybe he'd survived for this, for one impossible night when the numbers finally added up right. Sunday morning arrived without ceremony. The blizzard had exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Brian woke on the frozen porch where he'd spent the night, his body curled around the last ember of warmth from his own coat. 25 dogs and 3 newborn puppies had taken every inch of space inside. He'd given them that without question. At 6 o'clock, he forced himself to move. His joints screamed in protest, muscles locked from the cold. When he finally stood, he discovered his left pinky finger had gone white and waxy frostbite, 2nd degree at least. He'd deal with it later, or not at all, inside. Most of the dogs were awake, watching him with wary eyes. He checked them systematically, running his hands over each animal, feeling for injuries, checking paws for frostbite. 22 seemed stable. 3 remained dangerously weak. A husky lying too still in the corner. A border collie whose breathing came in shallow gasps. And an older retriever who wouldn't lift his head. Brian had no medicine, no veterinary knowledge beyond basic first aid. All he could offer was warmth and time. He melted snow in his largest pot, heating it until steam rose, then used torn pieces of his own flannel shirt as washcloths. He cleaned each dog methodically, working the warmth into their paws, their ears, the places where frostbite took hold first. The husky began to stir under his touch. The border collie's breathing deepened. The retriever didn't respond. While he worked, Brian examined the tattoos more carefully. 16 dogs bore military identification. The numbers told stories. If you knew how to read them, deployment years, unit designations, the bureaucratic fingerprints of the Department of Defense. These dogs had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. They'd searched for explosives, tracked insurgents, saved lives that would never know their names. One tattoo stopped his hands completely. A German Shepherd, male, roughly 8 years old, the number on his ear, 7428K. Brian's vision blurred. He knew that designation. He'd served alongside 7428K in Fallujah. 2 years after his own deployment ended, this dog, this specific animal, had been part of the Marine unit that replaced his own. Brian had never met him, but he'd heard the stories. Had found 18 IEDs in 7 months, 18 bombs that never killed anyone. Rex, Brian whispered. That had been the dog's name. He remembered now. Rex looked at him with clouded eyes. Too old for this. Too worn down by years of service followed by abandonment. Brian pressed his forehead against the dog's skull and stayed there for a long moment, feeling the animal's breath against his neck. A sound pulled him back, footsteps crunching through snow outside. Brian moved to the window. A man was approaching the cabin, maybe 50 years old, heavy-set, wearing an expensive North Face jacket. He carried a Remington 870 shotgun loosely in one hand. Brian opened the door just before the man could knock. They stared at each other for 3 seconds. "You Brian Carter?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" "Jerry Hutchins. That's my truck down on the switchback." He gestured toward the road with the shotgun barrel, not quite pointing it at Brian, but close enough to make the threat clear. "And those are my dogs you got in there?" Brian's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Your truck was abandoned. Driver ran." "Yeah." "Well," Jerry's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That driver worked for me. Panicked in the storm, the idiot. But the property's still mine. Those dogs are worth money, and I'm here to collect. They're not property. They're veterans. They're animals I purchased legally from military surplus auctions. Got the paperwork back in town if you need proof." Jerry shifted his weight, the shotgun moving slightly. "Now, I can see you went to some trouble here. Real good Samaritan shit. I appreciate that. So, here's what we're going to do. You give me back my dogs, and I won't press charges for theft. Hell, I might even pay you something for your time. Call it $200. Brian's voice came out flat. "Where were you taking them?" "That's not your concern." "Mexico, California, one of those facilities that doesn't ask questions about where meat comes from." Jerry's face hardened. "You better watch what you're implying, friend. I'm not your friend. And those dogs aren't leaving." For a moment, neither man moved. 25 dogs watched through the cabin's windows, silent witnesses to a negotiation that wasn't really a negotiation at all. Jerry broke first. He lowered the shotgun slightly and forced his smile back into place. "Look, I get it. You're attached now. That happens. Tell you what you keep 10? Your pick. I take the rest. Everybody wins." Nobody wins when veterans get sold for parts. Jesus Christ. Jerry's smile vanished completely. You're one of those, aren't you? One of those broken-down military types who thinks the world owes you something? These are just dogs, man. They ain't your squad. They ain't your brothers. They're merchandise that you stole. And if you don't return them, I'm coming back with the sheriff. Brian stepped fully outside, closing the door behind him. The cold bit immediately, but he barely noticed. Then bring the sheriff. Bring whoever you want, but you're not taking them? Jerry studied him for a long moment, and Brian saw the calculation happening behind those eyes, weighing options, assessing risks, deciding whether this particular fight was worth the trouble. Finally, Jerry nodded slowly. All right, he said quietly. All right, we'll do this the hard way. He turned and walked back toward the road, the shotgun still in his hand. Brian watched until the man disappeared into the tree line, then stood there in the snow for another minute, his frost-bitten finger throbbing, his body screaming for food he didn't have. Inside, Max was waiting. The old dog limped over and pressed against Brian's leg, offering what comfort he could. Brian sank down beside him, running his hand through Max's graying fur. He's coming back, Brian said quietly. Tonight. Probably. With friends. Max's tail thumped once against the floor. We can't fight them, can't call for help, radio's dead. And even if it worked, we're 23 miles from the nearest town. Brian looked around at the dogs watching him. 25 pairs of eyes. 28, counting the puppies. I don't know what to do here, boy. I don't know how to save them. But even as he said it, his hand moved to his coat pocket. The flare gun was still there, one round, one chance to send a signal into a sky that might not be watching. His other hand found the watch in his pocket, Thomas Thompson's watch, stopped permanently at 3:47, the moment the bomb had detonated. Brian had carried it for 15 years, a talisman of failure. Maybe tonight the numbers would be different. Maybe tonight someone would see the signal, or maybe he'd die on this mountain with 28 dogs, and in the spring they'd find all of them frozen together. One last failed mission in a life full of them. Brian stood up. He fed the last pieces of his bed frame into the stove and began to prepare for whatever darkness was coming. Jerry Hutchins returned at 9 o'clock that night, and he didn't come alone. Brian heard the vehicles before he saw them, 2 trucks grinding up the mountain road, headlights cutting through the darkness. He'd spent the afternoon fortifying what he could, stacking firewood against the door, wedging the windows shut with broken furniture, useless gestures. Really, if they wanted to get in, they'd get in. He checked the flare gun one more time. The single red flare sat in the chamber, his only connection to a world that might not be listening. Pine Ridge was 23 miles away. The nearest ranger station, 15. In perfect conditions, someone might see a flare from that distance. Might. The truck stopped 50 yards from the cabin. 3 men climbed out. Jerry was easy to spot, his bulk unmistakable even in silhouette. The other 2 were younger, harder looking. One carried a chainsaw. The other had a pistol tucked into his waistband, visible when his jacket shifted. What? Brian stepped outside before they reached the door. Max followed despite his pain, positioning himself between Brian and the approaching men. All 25 dogs were silent inside, as if they understood what was happening. Didn't think you'd actually be stupid enough to stay, Jerry called out. His breath misted in the cold air. Last chance. Carter, we can still do this easy. Can't give you what isn't yours to take. The man with the chainsaw, late 30s, military buzz cut, dead eyes, laughed. Tough guy, Jerry. You didn't say we were dealing with a tough guy. Chad, shut up, Jerry said. Then, to Brian, these are business associates, Chad Morrison and Ricky Dawson. They help me with complicated transactions. He took a few steps closer. Here's how this works. You got two options. One, you walk away right now. Take your dog, head down the mountain, forget you ever saw my property. Two, we make you walk away. Your choice. There's a third option, Brian said quietly. Yeah, what's that? You leave, now. And I don't report you to the FBI for trafficking military working dogs across state lines for illegal slaughter. The silence that followed was broken by Chad's laughter. Holy shit, he actually thinks. I said shut up, Jerry snapped. His face had gone red. You don't know what you're talking about. Carter, those dogs were legally purchased at government surplus auctions. Everything documented, everything legitimate. Then why were you driving them at night in a blizzard? Why no company markings on the truck? Why'd your driver run instead of waiting for help? Brian took a step forward. I checked the tattoos. 16 of those dogs have active duty markings less than 3 years old. The DOD doesn't auction active duty animals. They're supposed to be retired, adopted, or euthanized, not sold. Jerry's jaw tightened. You're making some serious accusations. I'm stating facts. You bought dogs that shouldn't have been for sale. Someone in procurement is on your payroll, and you're running them to facilities that don't ask questions. Mexico, probably. Maybe California. Meat processing plants that pay good money for. The gunshot cracked through the night air, echoing off the mountain. Brian flinched, but didn't move. The bullet had gone high, a warning shot into the trees. Ricky, younger than Chad, maybe 28. Twitchy, held a 9mm pistol, pointed at the sky. Next one ain't a warning, old man. Inside the cabin, the dogs erupted. 25 voices howling, barking, throwing themselves against the walls. The noise was primal, terrifying. Max's hackles rose, his lips pulling back from teeth that had lost none of their sharpness despite his age. Last chance, Jerry said, his voice harder now. Walk away, or we put you down like a rabid dog and take what's ours anyway. Your choice ends in 10 seconds. Brian's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers closing around the flare gun. He could fire it now, send that signal into the darkness. But Jerry and his men would see it too, would know help was coming, would disappear before anyone arrived, taking the dogs with them, or worse, would kill the dogs rather than leave evidence. No, if he fired the flare. It had to be when he had no other options left. 10, Jerry said. 9. Brian didn't move. 8. Max growled, a low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. 7. 6. Chad started the chainsaw. The engine roared to life, a mechanical scream that drowned out everything else. He walked toward the cabin's door, the spinning blade held low. Pity. Brian made his decision. He turned and ran not away, but toward the cabin door. He slammed it open, dove inside as Chad's chainsaw bit into the doorframe, spraying splinters. Max followed, and Brian kicked the door shut behind them. Barricade, he shouted to no one, to 25 dogs who couldn't understand English but somehow understood everything. He shoved his remaining furniture against the door, a shelf, a trunk, everything he had left. The chainsaw bit through the door 6 inches from his head. The blade screamed, cutting a horizontal line, then stopped. Ouch! Chad was laughing. "This is fun," the man yelled. "How long you think this door's gonna last?" Brian looked around the cabin. 25 military dogs stared back at him. 3 puppies nursed at their mother's side, oblivious. Max stood at his feet, ready to fight, despite the cancer eating through his bones, despite knowing this was a fight he couldn't win. 15 years ago, Brian had watched 6 men die because he'd made the wrong calculation, had prioritized the mission over their lives, had told Thomas Thompson to go check that bomb because someone had to. And Thomas had the training. He'd lived with that math for 15 years. Had let it define him, break him, drive him into these mountains where nobody could ask him to choose again. But here, in this cabin, surrounded by animals who'd served the same flag he had, who'd risked the same things and received the same abandonment in return, Brian realized something. He'd been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't, "Why did I survive?" It was, "What am I willing to die for?" The window exploded inward. Ricky had smashed it with a rock, reaching through to unlock it from inside. His hand fumbled with the latch. Brian pulled the flare gun from his pocket. One shot, one chance. He aimed it not at Ricky, not at the door, but up, straight up at the wooden ceiling of his cabin. The flare would burn through, shoot into the sky, a beacon of red fire visible for miles. It would also probably set his home ablaze. Everything he'd built in 5 years of hiding would burn. Small price. Brian pulled the trigger. The flare launched with a hollow thump, punching through the ceiling in a shower of sparks and splintered wood. For 3 seconds, the cabin was lit by a hellish red light as the flare rocketed upward, trailing phosphorus fire. Then it was gone, arcing into the night sky 300 feet above, a brilliant crimson star that burned and burned and burned. Outside, Jerry screamed something incoherent. Chad's chainsaw stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the crackling of small fires starting in the ceiling where the flare had passed through. Max stood beside Brian, both of them watching the hole in the roof where stars were visible now, hidden distant and uncaring as around them. 25 dogs had gone silent, as if they too were waiting to see if anyone in the world was watching. Brian's watch. Thomas Thompson's watch pressed against his chest in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at the frozen hands. 3:47. His own watch read 1:32 in the morning. Jerry and his men would be inside in minutes. Help, if it came at all, wouldn't arrive for an hour, maybe 2. Brian had made his calculation, had sent his signal. Now, all he could do was hold the line until someone answered, or until there was nothing left to hold. The chainsaw roared back to life. Chad was cutting through the door in earnest now, the blade chewing through timber that Brian had spent weeks selecting and fitting. Each pass brought the men closer. Brian grabbed the iron poker from beside the stove, the only weapon he had left. Then, over the scream of the chainsaw came another sound, faint at first, then growing. Engines. Multiple engines. Coming up the mountain road. Chad stopped cutting. The sudden silence was profound. "The hell is that?" Ricky's voice. Uncertain now. Through the broken window, Brian could see lights, not 2 or 3 vehicles, dozens, headlights snaking up the switchback road like a river of fire, one after another after another. Jerry's voice outside, "Move, we're leaving now." Footsteps running, truck doors slamming, engine starting. Within 30 seconds, Jerry Hutchins and his men were gone, their taillights disappearing down the mountain as the approaching convoy climbed higher. Brian stood in his ruined cabin, poker still in hand, unable to process what was happening. The first vehicles arrived 4 minutes later, pickup trucks, SUVs, an ambulance with veterinary clinic markings, 2 television vans with satellite dishes. They kept coming, parking wherever they could find space, doors opening, people spilling out into the snow, 50 people, 100, more. A woman in her mid-40s stepped forward first, flanked by 2 younger men carrying medical bags. She wore a wildlife rescue jacket and had the efficient movement of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Brian Carter," she called out. He nodded. "Mute? Jennifer Walsh, Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue. We saw your flare from the ranger station 15 miles out, posted it on the veteran networks. Someone recognized your location. Word spread fast." She gestured at the crowd behind her. "These people drove through the night to get here. Now, where are the dogs?" Brian stepped aside. The cabin door, half destroyed by the chainsaw, swung open. 25 dogs stared out at the crowd of strangers, uncertain whether this was rescue or another threat. The next hour became a blur of organized chaos. Veterinarians moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, examining each dog, administering fluids, antibiotics, pain medication. The 3 puppies were carefully placed in a heated carrier. The weakest dogs were loaded into the ambulance first. Brian stood outside, watching it all happen, feeling oddly disconnected. Mac sat beside him, leaning heavily against his leg. "Brian Carter." He turned. A woman stood there, maybe 45 years old, with gray and blonde hair and eyes so blue they seemed to glow in the harsh LED work lights someone had set up. She wore a heavy parka, but her hands were bare. She wasn't smiling. Behind her stood a teenage boy, 17 or 18, tall and awkward, in the way of young men who haven't grown into their frames yet. His face. Brian's stomach dropped. He knew that face, had seen it in countless photographs, carried one in his pocket for 15 years. The same strong jaw, the same direct gaze, the same slight asymmetry to the eyebrows. "You're Elizabeth Thompson," Brian said quietly. "I am." Her voice was steady, controlled. "And this is Dylan, my son." She paused. "Thomas's son." The mountain seemed to tilt slightly. Brian reached out, steadying himself against the cabin wall. "He never met his father," Elizabeth continued. "Thomas died 3 weeks before Dylan was born, but he left letters, instructions. One of them said that if he didn't come home, I should find you, that you'd tell Dylan what kind of man his father was." "Mrs. Thompson, The slap came without warning. Elizabeth's hand connected with his cheek, hard enough to snap his head sideways. The crowd around them went silent. Even the dogs seemed to pause. 15 years, she said, and her voice finally cracked. 15 years I looked for you. Called the VA, the veterans groups, tracked down everyone who served with Thomas. No one knew where you were. No one had seen you since you disappeared from the hospital in Germany. Tears were running down her face now, but her eyes blazed with anger. You vanished, like Thomas had never existed, like the 6 men who died that day meant nothing. You survived, and then you ran away and hid in these mountains while the rest of us had to keep living." Her hands were shaking. Why, why did you get to run when we had to stay and face it every single day?" Brian's throat had closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The shame that had driven him into these mountains was suddenly there between them, exposed, undeniable. "Why you—" Elizabeth whispered. "Why are you alive and my husband is dead?" Dylan stood frozen behind his mother, his young face struggling to process this confrontation that was 15 years in the making. Brian looked at them both, this woman and this boy who carried Thomas Thompson's face into a world Thomas would never see. He opened his mouth to explain, to apologize, to offer some accounting for why he'd chosen cowardice over courage. But Max moved first. The old dog limped forward, every step clearly painful, and sat directly in front of Elizabeth. He looked up at her with clouded eyes, then very gently placed his head against her knee. Elizabeth's anger crumbled. She dropped to her knees in the snow, and Max pressed closer, offering the comfort that Brian couldn't find words for. Her hands sank into his fur, and she sobbed against his neck, while Dylan stood helpless, watching his mother break open. Finally, Brian found his voice. It came out raw, destroyed. "He saved them," Brian said. "Thomas, when that IED went off, he was between the blast and the rest of us. Took the full force. The engineer said later that if he'd been standing anywhere else, if the angle had been different, we all would have died. But he was there, right there, and he caught the fire that was meant for 7 people." Elizabeth looked up at him, her face wet with tears. "I didn't run because I didn't care," Brian continued. "I ran because I cared too much. Every morning I woke up and he was still dead and I was still alive. And that math never made sense, never felt fair. So I came here to—" His voice broke. "To what?" "To hide until it made sense. It never made sense, Mrs. Thompson. It still doesn't." "Then why save these dogs?" Dylan spoke for the first time, his voice young but steady. "If you think you didn't deserve to live, why risk everything for them?" Brian looked at the boy, at Thomas's son, and understood that this question was the only one that mattered. He turned toward the cabin, where veterinarians were still working, where 25 dogs were receiving care they'd been denied for years. "Because last night, for the first time since Fallujah, I wasn't asking why I survived. I was asking what I'd do with surviving." Brian met Dylan's eyes. "Your father didn't die so I could waste his sacrifice hiding in these mountains. He died believing that the people he saved would do something worth saving." Max whimpered, a small sound, almost inaudible. Brian looked down and saw the old dog's legs buckling. He dropped to his knees, catching Max before he fell. "Get a vet," someone shouted. But Brian knew. He'd known since Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis, had known every day of the past 6 months. Max had held on through the blizzard, through the rescue, through this confrontation, had given everything he had left. Now there was nothing more to give. A veterinarian ran over a young man with kind eyes, but Brian waved him back. "Just give us a minute." He gathered Max into his arms, held him the way he should have held Thomas 15 years ago. The other dogs, still in the cabin, began to howl, not aggressive, not fearful, mournful. the ancient sound of a pack mourning one of their own. Elizabeth knelt beside Brian in the snow. Dylan joined her. Together, the three of them held Max as his breathing slowed. "You did good, boy," Brian whispered. "You did so good. You can rest now. We're not alone anymore." Max's tail moved once. His eyes found Brian's and held them, then very gently, as if falling asleep. He was gone. The veterinarian checked for a pulse, then shook his head. 7:47 in the morning. Exactly 4 hours after Brian had fired the flare. Exactly 4 hours after Thomas Thompson's watch read 3:47, frozen in time, a number that had followed Brian like a ghost. 7:47, a new number, a different calculation. The dogs in the cabin had gone quiet. The crowd of rescuers stood in respectful silence. Elizabeth's hand found Brian's shoulder and squeezed. "He was a good dog," she said softly. "He was better than me," Brian replied. "Maybe," Elizabeth said. "But he thought you were worth saving. Maybe it's time you believed him." Somewhere in the growing dawn light, a raven called. Brian held Max's body and wept for the first time in 15 years, wept for his dog, for Thomas, for 6 men who'd never come home, for all the years he'd wasted believing that survival was a sin. And in that breaking, something inside him finally began to heal. The sun was fully up by 8:30, revealing the true scale of what had converged on Brian's Mountain. Over 1,500 people had made the journey through the night. Veterans from posts across Colorado, animal rescue volunteers, journalists, law enforcement, and civilians who'd simply heard the story and felt compelled to witness it. Jennifer Walsh from Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue had taken charge of coordinating the veterinary care. All 25 dogs were now stabilized, fed, and receiving treatment. 3 would need surgery for injuries sustained during their ordeal, but all would survive. The 3 puppies, now being called the Miracle 3 by the gathering crowd, were thriving under heat lamps in the veterinary ambulance. Sheriff Tom Bradley of Pine Ridge arrived at 9 o'clock with 2 deputies and an FBI agent named Sarah Chen. They'd been tracking Jerry Hutchins for 8 months, following a trail of military surplus dogs that had disappeared from official records. Brian's flare had interrupted what would have been Hutchins' final run, a delivery of 25 dogs to a processing facility in Juarez that paid $2,000 per animal. No questions asked. "We got him at a roadblock 15 miles down," Bradley told Brian. "Him and his associates found documentation in the truck purchase records going back 3 years, 127 dogs total. He was buying them from a procurement officer at Fort Carson who's been selling off military working dogs and pocketing the retirement fees." "The dogs that were supposed to be adopted?" Brian asked. "Or humanely euthanized if they had medical issues too severe for civilian life. Instead, they went to Hutchins for $500 to $800 each. He'd transport them to buyers who didn't care about provenance." Agent Chen's expression was grim. "You saved these 25, but we estimate at least 90 of the others are already dead." The number sat heavy in the cold morning air. 90 military working dogs, veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, sold like scrap metal and destroyed for parts. Elizabeth had been listening quietly. Now she stepped forward. "What happens to these 25? They become evidence for now." Chen said, "Once the trial concludes, they'll be released for adoption through proper channels, military working dog veteran programs, mostly, We'll make sure they go to good homes. How long will that take? 18 months, maybe 2 years. These cases move slowly. That's too long, Elizabeth said flatly. These dogs have already waited long enough. Brian looked at her, understanding dawning. What are you thinking? Elizabeth turned to face him fully. In the morning light, he could see the resemblance between her and Dylan more clearly, the same determination in the set of their jaws, the same refusal to accept defeat. Thomas's last letter, she said, the one I mentioned. He didn't just ask me to find you if he didn't come home. He asked me to make sure his death meant something, to turn it into something that helped others. She gestured at the 25 dogs, at the crowd of people who'd driven through the night. This is how we do that. This is how we make sure no more military dogs end up in trucks headed for slaughter. A sanctuary, Brian said slowly. Not just a sanctuary, a healing center for military working dogs and the veterans who serve with them. Elizabeth's voice grew stronger as the vision clarified. Pair them up. Let them heal each other. Thomas believed the bond between a handler and their dog was sacred, that it saved lives in ways the military never measured. Dylan spoke up, his young voice carrying surprising authority. I'll help. I'm taking a gap year before college anyway. I can volunteer. Brian looked around at his ruined cabin at the mountain that had been his hiding place for 5 years, at Max's body, now wrapped in a blanket by respectful hands, at the faces of 1,500 people who'd proven that the world he'd fled from wasn't as cold as he'd believed. I don't have money, he said. The disability check barely covers. You don't need money. Jennifer Walsh pulled out her phone. The story's already viral. Someone posted video of the rescue on Facebook 6 hours ago. It's been shared 2.3 million times. There's a GoFundMe that started at 4 this morning. She showed him the screen. $480,000 and climbing. By noon, you'll have enough to buy this land from the federal government and build a proper facility. Brian stared at the number, unable to process it. That's not possible. It's very possible, Walsh said. You touched something in people. A veteran with PTSD who risked everything to save military dogs. That's a story that matters. People want to be part of it. Agent Chen cleared her throat. If you establish a recognized sanctuary, I can arrange for these 25 dogs to be released to your custody immediately. The evidence we need is the documentation Hutchins kept. We don't need to hold the animals themselves. But you'd need to move fast. File nonprofit paperwork, get proper licensing, establish oversight. I can help with that, Elizabeth said. She looked at Brian steadily. I ran a nonprofit for 7 years after Thomas died. Helped military families navigate VA benefits. I know the process. We could have everything filed within a week if we worked together. There it was. The choice Brian had been running from for 15 years, presented in crystalline clarity. He could retreat back into his mountains, back into the safety of isolation and guilt. Or he could step forward into something terrifying and uncertain and impossibly hopeful. He thought about Max, who'd limped through a blizzard on a dying leg to lead Brian to 25 dogs who needed saving. He thought about Thomas Thompson, walking toward a bomb because someone had to, and he had the training. He thought about 6 men who died believing their sacrifice would matter. Okay, Brian said quietly. Let's do it. The cheer that went up from the crowd startled him. He hadn't realized how many people were listening, waiting for his answer. Phones came out, documenting the moment. Journalists surged forward with questions. But Elizabeth held up a hand, and somehow the crowd quieted. She had that gift command presence, the military called it, the ability to own a space without raising your voice. "We'll take questions later," she announced. "Right now, we have work to do. Anyone with veterinary or construction experience, check in with Jennifer Walsh. Anyone with nonprofit or legal background, find me. Everyone else." She paused, looking around at the 1,500 faces. "Go home. Tell people what you saw here. Tell them that warriors, whether they have 2 legs or 4, deserve better than being thrown away when they're no longer useful." The crowd began to disperse slowly. Reluctantly, but they dispersed. Dylan stayed close to his mother, stealing glances at Brian when he thought the man wasn't looking. Brian recognized that expression. It was the same way he'd looked at his own father's military photos as a child, searching for something to hold on to, some understanding of a man who existed mostly in stories. "He looks like Thomas," Brian said to Elizabeth quietly. "He has Thomas's courage, too. Came out when he was 15, lost half his friends, got bullied at school, but he never hid who he was." She smiled slightly. "Thomas would have been proud." "I'm sorry I wasn't there," Brian said. "After. I should have. You're here now." Elizabeth cut him off, but her tone was gentle. "That's what matters. Thomas used to say the guilt was just love with nowhere to go. Maybe it's time you let it go somewhere useful." By noon, the GoFundMe had reached $1.8 million. A retired Marine named David Chen had donated $250,000 anonymously, leaving only a note. "You saved my brother's case as partner. Now, let me save yours." By 3 in the afternoon, Elizabeth had assembled a team of 12 people, lawyers, nonprofit specialists, accountants, all working pro bono to establish what they were now calling Warrior's Pause. The name had been Dylan's suggestion, and it stuck immediately. By sunset, Brian stood in the ruins of his cabin with Elizabeth and Dylan, watching as volunteers began the process of laying markers for a proper facility. The architectural plans were rough but ambitious: 6 large kennels, a veterinary clinic, a therapeutic center for handlers and dogs, housing for residents and volunteers. Max's body had been taken to a veterinary mortuary in Denver, where he would be cremated with military honors. The ashes would return to the mountain, to be buried at the entrance of the sanctuary that his sacrifice had made possible. "What was he like?" Dylan asked suddenly. "My father." Brian took a long breath. For 15 years, he'd avoided this question, terrified of the inadequacy of any answer. But standing here on a mountain transformed by the collision of tragedy and grace, he found the words came easier than expected. "He was the best of us," Brian said simply, "made terrible jokes, could fix anything with duct tape and determination, read mystery novels when he thought no one was watching." He smiled at the memory. "He talked about you constantly. Your mother was 3 months pregnant when we deployed. He carried the ultrasound photo in his helmet. Used to show it to everyone, even the Iraqi kids we'd meet on patrol." Dylan's eyes were wet, but he didn't look away. "The day he died," Brian continued, "he walked us toward that bomb knowing what would happen, knew the odds. Did it anyway. because 7 people were depending on him making the right choice. Brian met Dylan's gaze directly. "You asked me earlier why I saved these dogs. The truth is, your father's been saving people for 15 years. He just had to wait for me to figure out how to let him." The 3 of them stood together as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and crimson around them. Dozens of people worked to build something that hadn't existed that morning, a place where broken things could become whole again. 1,500 people had come to a mountain in the middle of nowhere because they'd seen a flare in the darkness and decided it mattered, because one man had chosen to save 25 dogs instead of himself, because an old dog with cancer had refused to let his handler die alone. The math still didn't make sense. 6 men dead, 1 man alive, 90 dogs dead, 25 saved, Max gone, but 3 puppies born in a blizzard. But maybe, Brian thought, the math didn't need to make sense. Maybe it just needed to mean something. 2 years passed like water finding its course, slow at first, then with gathering momentum, reshaping the landscape as it moved. The spring of 27 arrived in Colorado with the kind of perfect weather that felt like benediction. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, wildflowers beginning their annual resurrection across the meadows. On a Saturday morning in late April, over 3,000 people gathered on a mountain that had once been home to one man's exile. Warriors' Paws stretched across 12 acres of land that Brian had purchased from the federal government, with donations that eventually totaled $3.2 million. 6 large barn structures housed the residential kennels, each designed by veterinary architects to maximize both comfort and therapeutic value. The medical clinic occupied a converted log building with state-of-the-art surgical equipment. The main lodge where handlers and dogs could spend time together, where group therapy sessions happened, where healing occurred in ways both measurable and mysterious, stood at the center of it all. Timber and glass and hope made manifest. 47 people worked at Warriors' Paws now. 80% were veterans themselves. They understood what it meant to come home to a country that thanked you for your service and then forgot you existed. They knew the particular isolation of PTSD, the way it made you a stranger in your own skin. The sanctuary had rescued 187 military working dogs in 2 years. Some came through official channels, released from service with medical issues that made civilian adoption difficult. Others were found through the network of veterans who'd heard about Warriors' Paws and reached out when they discovered a former military dog in a shelter, or worse. Jerry Hutchins' prosecution had shone a spotlight on the gaps in military animal retirement protocols, forcing reforms that saved countless lives. 94 successful matches had been made, veterans paired with dogs, each finding in the other something they'd lost. The statistics were remarkable. A 68% reduction in PIT symptoms among participants, an 82% decrease in suicidal ideation, a 91% improvement in overall life satisfaction scores. But Brian didn't think about the statistics much. He thought about faces, like Marcus Webb, a Marine who'd spent 3 years after his discharge living in his car, who now worked as a trainer at the sanctuary and slept soundly for the first time since Helmand Province, like Rachel Torres, an Army medic who tried to take her own life twice before meeting a Belgian Malinois named Shadow, and who now ran support groups for other female veterans struggling with transition, like Dylan Thompson, who deferred college for 2 years and become the sanctuary's primary handler trainer. At 19, he had his father's quiet intensity and his mother's organizational brilliance. The young veterans responded to him differently than they did to the older staff, saw in him something uncomplicated by their own experiences, a bridge to a future where their trauma didn't define them. The grand opening ceremony began at 10 o'clock. Governor Richardson gave a speech about Colorado's commitment to veteran welfare. Senator Martinez announced the MAX Act, federal legislation requiring proper retirement protocols for all military working dogs. Jennifer Walsh from Rocky Mountain Animal Rescue presented Brian with a conservation award he immediately felt uncomfortable receiving. But the moment that mattered most came when they unveiled the statue. It stood 8 feet tall at the sanctuary's main entrance, cast in bronze by a sculptor in Denver who donated her work, Max. Rendered in perfect detail, sitting at attention, his gaze fixed on the mountains beyond. The plaque at the base read simply, "Max, not all heroes bark, but this one did." 2005-20, Brian stood before it with Elizabeth and Dylan, surrounded by 3,000 people who'd come to witness this moment. Many had been part of that night 2 years ago, had driven through darkness to answer a flare's call. Others were veterans who'd found healing here, or families who'd lost someone to war or to the isolation that followed. Children were already touching the statue's nose, a tradition that had begun spontaneously at some point during construction and stuck. Touch Max's nose for luck, for protection, for the promise that someone was watching over the lost ones. "He'd hate this," Brian said quietly, looking up at the bronze rendering of his dog. "All this attention, he'd tolerate it for you," Elizabeth replied. "The way he tolerated everything else." Dylan stepped forward and placed a wreath of wildflowers at the statue's base. He'd made it himself that morning, picking blooms from the meadow where Max used to walk when his legs still worked. Purple lupin, yellow balsam root, white columbine, Colorado's palette of resurrection. "I never met Max," Dylan said, his voice carrying across the crowd through the microphone someone had set up, "but I feel like I knew him because I see what he left behind." He gestured at the sanctuary, at the people gathered. "My father died before I was born. I spent 17 years wondering what he stood for, what his life meant. Then I met Brian, and I understood us. My father stood for the idea that some things are worth dying for. Max showed me that some things are worth living for." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he didn't stop. "This sanctuary exists because one man listened to one dog on one impossible night. Because Max knew that Brian needed a reason to come back from wherever he'd been hiding. Because 25 dogs needed someone to believe they were worth saving." Dylan looked directly at Brian. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for coming back." The applause was thunderous, but Brian barely heard it. He was looking at the faces in the crowd, at Marcus and Rachel, and 47 other veterans who'd found their way here, at the handlers and their dogs, standing together in the morning sun, at Elizabeth, whose grief had transformed into purpose, at Dylan, who carried his father's legacy forward into a world Thomas would never see, at the 3 puppies, no longer puppies now, but young dogs nearly 2 years old who'd been born in a blizzard and named Thomas, Marcus, Elizabeth, and Max the second. They were being trained as therapy dogs, carrying forward the work their mother had begun that impossible night, Brian walked to the microphone. He hadn't prepared a speech, hadn't wanted to speak at all, but Elizabeth had insisted. "People need to hear from you," she'd said. "They need to know this is real." He looked out at 3,000 faces and felt the weight of their expectations. For 2 years, he'd been called a hero by people who didn't understand that heroes were the ones who didn't come home. Heroes were Thomas Thompson walking toward a bomb. Heroes were Max limping through a blizzard on a leg that should have been amputated months before. Brian was just a man who'd finally stopped running. "I don't have a speech prepared," he began, and his voice sounded strange through the speakers, too loud, too exposed. "I'm not good at this. Public speaking, being the center of attention. I spent 5 years in these mountains specifically to avoid both." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd. 2 years ago, I thought I knew why I'd survived when better men hadn't. I thought it was punishment, a cosmic mistake, the universe getting its math wrong. Brian paused, finding the words. "Then Max dragged me out into a blizzard to save 25 dogs, and I realized I'd been asking the wrong question the whole time." He looked at the statue, at the bronze rendering of the dog who'd saved him by refusing to let him save himself. The question isn't, why did I survive? The question is, what will I do with surviving? And the answer, his voice caught. He took a breath and continued. The answer is this. These dogs, these veterans, this place where broken things can become whole again. Brian gestured at the sanctuary spread out below them. "Warrior's Pause isn't mine. It belongs to every veteran who walks through those gates and finds something they thought they'd lost forever. It belongs to every military dog who gave years of their life to a country that forgot to say thank you. It belongs to Max, who taught me that heroes don't quit. They just pass the leash to whoever's ready to hold it." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. If you're a veteran struggling with coming home, you have a place here. If you know a military dog that needs help, we'll find them. If you're looking for a way to serve something bigger than yourself, we're always looking for volunteers. Brian's hands gripped the podium. Max saved 25 dogs that night, but those 25 dogs saved 1,500 people. And those 1,500 people built this. That's how healing works. That's how we honor the ones who didn't make it home. We keep saving each other. He stepped back from the microphone. The applause started slowly, then built not the polite applause of ceremony, but something rawer, more genuine. People were crying openly. Veterans were embracing. The dogs, sensing the emotional shift in their handlers, pressed closer. Elizabeth took Brian's hand and squeezed it. Dylan moved to his other side. The three of them stood together before Max's statue, before the sanctuary that had risen from one man's decision to stop hiding, and watched as the crowd gradually dispersed into the facility, touring the kennels, meeting the dogs, beginning their own journeys toward whatever healing looked like for them. By evening, the official events had concluded, but hundreds of people remained, unwilling to leave. They sat in the meadows, walked the trails, gathered around fire pits as the sun set behind the mountains in shades of amber and rose. Brian found himself at Max's grave, a small plot beside the statue, marked by a simple stone. He sat in the grass, watching the last light fade from the sky. Dylan found him there an hour later. "Mom's looking for you, pet," the young man said. "Planning meeting for next month's intake. Tell her I'll be there in a minute." Dylan sat down instead. They were quiet for a while, two people who'd found each other through the absence of a man they'd both loved. "Do you think about him?" Dylan asked finally. "My father." "Do you think about him every day?" Brian considered the question carefully. "Not every day anymore, but most days, and when I do, it's different now. Less guilt, more gratitude." He looked at Dylan. "Thomas gave me 42 years I wouldn't have had. Took me a long time to understand I was supposed to do something with them." "You're doing something with them." "We all are," Brian corrected. "That's the point. Your father's sacrifice didn't end when he died. It just kept rippling outward, touching more and more people. You, me, Elizabeth, every veteran who finds their way here. Thomas is still saving lives. He just has a lot more help now." Dylan nodded slowly, processing this. "Then, I'm going to college in the fall, University of Colorado, but I'll come back every weekend, every break. This place," he gestured at the sanctuary, "this is what I want to do with my life. Help people like you and my dad. Help the dogs who served." "Your father would be proud of you," Brian said. "I know I am." They sat together as full darkness fell, and one by one lights came on across the sanctuary, the kennels, the lodge, the clinic, 12 acres of illumination against the mountain night. Inside those buildings, 93 dogs slept peacefully. 312 veterans had passed through the program. 47 people had found employment. Thousands had found hope. All because one old dog with cancer had refused to let his handler die alone. All because 25 dogs had needed saving, and one man had finally found a reason to stop hiding. Brian stood, brushing grass from his pants. Dylan stood with him. Together they walked back toward the lodge, where Elizabeth was waiting, where plans were being made for next month and next year and all the years beyond. Behind them, Max's statue kept its bronze vigil, nose polished bright by countless hands seeking luck or protection or simply connection to something larger than themselves. The math still didn't make sense. It probably never would. But the meaning was clear. If you've ever felt invisible after years of service, whether in uniform, at home, or in your community, Brian's story speaks to something. We all carry the question of whether our sacrifices mattered. For too long, we've been told that moving on means forgetting, that healing requires leaving the past behind. But Brian discovered what many of us know in our bones: true healing comes when we transform our pain into purpose, when we stop running from our guilt and start running towards something worth building. Max didn't save Brian by taking away his trauma. He saved him by showing him that brokenness can be the foundation for something beautiful, that the very experiences that shattered us can become the tools we use to help others. Every veteran who walks through Warrior's Paws, every military dog given dignity in retirement, every life touched by this sanctuary proves that it's never too late to answer the call. Your scars aren't disqualifications, they're credentials. Your survival wasn't random, it was preparation. The question isn't why you're still here. The question is what you'll build with the time you've been given. What's the one thing you've survived that could become your reason for helping others? And if you could create your own warrior's pause, a place where your pain becomes purpose, what would it look like? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters, and someone needs to hear it today.